So it's a nice warm February day. Suddenly we have a little nicer weather, but of course scary part is all the trees will start waking up. So it's time to rush out and get some dormant cuttings off my figs, and just thought I'd do a little video on starting figs from cuttings, which is super easy. So to start with, I've got a nice long piece I cut off here. In terms of size, basically up to about thumb width. And first thing I'll do is take off, when I have this much to work with, I will take off the terminal bud. Terminal bud is always going to be the first to break, and I wanted to spend more time setting roots before I have top growth. And then I use the Ziploc bag method. So basically, I want to be able to cut them and store them in a Ziploc in the fridge, and try and look for a place where I'm halfway between a pair of buds. All right, drop that one. Just kind of go along. And so forth. I'll just finish these up. All right, so those are all cut up and ready to go in the bags, and I'll write on the bags what type they are to keep that all straight. So nice cutting like this has got plenty of buds, plenty of very dormant buds, so it'll be a while till they push, so it can spend effort on the rooting. Figs are just super easy to root, so I have enough that I'm choosing the best wood for rooting for me. But I will say I have rooted things like this. It's not that hard. This is a terminal bud. It will start pushing early. Sometimes I'll pinch those off, but even a little piece like this, when you're careful with it, you can make it work. But these are really a little more ideal. A lot of energy in this wood, very dormant buds, so the roots have more time to really get going, and then I could just kind of do that easily. This one is fine, but it's, if I run out of pots, this will be the first one to go, just because it's near the top where the wood was green and maybe had not really lignified, which means, it goes brown and not hardened up as much going into the winter. So it's possible that this might have some winter damage. So that would be the first one I'd toss. But if I have enough pots, I'll give them all a chance. So we'll go ahead and take a look at that next. All right, I think we're ready to get started. So here again are just some of the things I'll be using. So parafilm, plastic, using one or the other, and I'll show you how I use those. A garden marker. This is better than a Sharpie, holds better in the sun. I'll use this two ways to mark both the cutting and the container. And then just a quick utility knife that is just a quick and easy way to throw some holes into the bottom and make sure we have drainage. So let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so the first thing we'll be using the marker. Very simple. Grab my container, put the name of the cutting I will be doing. This is 4 Mile Green. Put it somewhere else. 4 Mile Green. That's just a quick and easy way to do it. Set that aside. Now, go to my cuttings, and just to show you that there's obviously some moisture on these, which is good. Just they've been in the sun a little bit, little condensation already in the bag. So, all right, now take my cutting, and somewhere up near the top, I'm going to write 4 Mile Green. All right, so now I have it in two places, just a little safety. One time I had a squirrel knock over a bunch of plants. The cuttings are lying on the ground, which is which. This is helpful. Anyway, very simple, but it's worth a little time just to make sure you know later. All right. Now, basically with any kind of cutting, you're in a race between the scion dying and the scion rooting. So the two things that will take a scion out are going to be rot and deterioration of the cutting and drying out. So to keep it from drying out, I'm going to take the top of this scion and I'm going to cover it. So a couple ways to do that. One is to simply just take some plastic, this is just from a newspaper, over the top. Oops. This is a little harder to work with, but I go over and around, and then get myself a rubber band and just make sure that's covered. All right, there's a scion ready to go. Okay, or cutting, same thing. So that will keep the top from drying out, and this is to me a much better method. People often put bags over the top, all sorts of things, but I just want to make sure that cutting at the top does not dry out. Those other things help, but what you get is then a very humid environment that your cutting is starting to leaf out in, and when you have to then taper that off, you're kind of fighting because it's going to dry out faster and so forth. This way the growth is right there in the real world once it breaks through. Try not to cover the top buds, but if you do, you'll see it pushing and you can cut it by if you need to. So that's one way. And let me just, I'll prepare one other. This is my preferred, but you know, everybody has a plastic bag, so I showed that first. This is called parafilm, and this is used in medical and scientific, and you can buy it quite cheaply. And it basically is a wax impregnated material that stretches and self-seals. So in this case, put my thumb, stretch it out, wrap around, go over the top, around, break it off. It self-seals, much easier, much faster. And again, before I lose track of things, what have I got to do? Of course, mark it for mile green. And I can read my handwriting even if nobody else can. So, all right, I prepared two. Let's take the container we started with. Here's where we take our utility knife. Here's a container. Just simply, cut in a couple places. Okay, it's not a big deal to get a little water in there. We just don't want them later on when they're growing so it's just a quick way to make nice simple drainage. All right, and then I take my cutting, and I'll go ahead with the one with the parafilm, since I'll go ahead and use that for all of them. And I'm going to just push this down into the container, basically almost all the way. So then I'm going to snug it around. That's why we fill these right to the top. We want as much soil around the stem as possible. Now let's talk a little bit about these containers. Of course, we're recycling, reusing, and all that stuff. These are good because they're deep, so I can keep most of the sign underground, most of the cutting. They also are basically like having a big jiffy pot or a biodegradable pot. So when someone wants to pot this on or put it in the ground, you merely just peel the top so it's not a wicking, drying out part, but just peel the top a little bit and you can plant the entire thing. The roots will just power right out of the bottom, no problem. You could also put a couple slices on the sides if you want to, not really needed, but I have done that in a few cases. But so these are actually great and they're cheap. Obviously, you gotta eat all that oatmeal first, but that's a good thing, right? Anyway, and so then this is ready to go. So this is better than, like, a 1 gallon pot is not gonna be as deep. I can get more of it covered and this really works. So as talked about, there's two things that are gonna keep cutting from surviving and flourishing, and that is drying out and then deterioration and rot, breakdown. So this soil, the ProMix BX, there's other ProMixes, make sure whichever you use has no added fertilizer, right? The importance of that is fertilizers are generally going to be a richer thing that will be more likely to lead to rots and molds and so forth and breakdown, and we don't want that. There's nothing, this plant's not going to feed on anything now, so we don't want to encourage that. Also is a really good draining mix. Sometimes you can even add more perlite. Didn't make this super wet. I will not add any water. Actually, I may just have a little dribble of water right around the top just to get a good connection of the soil to the cutting. But it's quite dry and it doesn't need any more water, and these are just good to go. So these are great way to reuse them, and as I say, you're not going to disturb the roots. A lot of people seem to overcomplicate fig cuttings to me. They'll put them into a container with sphagnum moss and they'll leave them until they start to see roots, and then they'll move them on. To me, you're disturbing it. I get almost 100% takes. Almost all of these are going to live, if not all of them. I think last year I didn't lose a single cutting. So why disturb them if they're going to root well anyway? Why put them through multiple phases? I mean, people like to see the roots and see what's happening. I guess that's nice, but really for me, it's not worth it. All right, there we go. That's 22 figs and 3 pomegranates, cuttings all set, ready to go. Now you don't absolutely have to, particularly with the figs, you don't absolutely have to cover the tops, and I've certainly done it without that, and you'll get some takes. You can do fairly well that way. I just would like to make sure I give them the extra little effort. Try and get them all to come, and they probably all will. I'll put these down in the basement, about 65 degrees, just sitting on the floor, and I'll leave them there. Keep an eye on them. When I start to see little green tips pushing, they'll push right through that parafilm. Then I'll get them either under the lights, or depending on when that happens, maybe move them outside if it's warm enough. But no special heating mats or anything. When you warm them too much, you're actually also inviting more of that mold and rot and other things. So keeping them slower actually seems to work well for me to just keep it simple. And like I said, I think people overcomplicate it, and it's not necessary. So hopefully we'll have 25 trees in about a month and a half.